Our study of the book of Daniel concludes today with Daniel chapter 12, this Tuesday, June 21st, 2022. The title of this devotional is The Great Tribulation and Armageddon. Now, our study of this wonderful book is going to focus on, in our conclusion, the Great Tribulation. Now, a little bit of a review. Daniel 11 concluded with the rise of great wickedness in the world, and the Antichrist exalted himself. We found him in Daniel 7, described as the little horn. Well, the Antichrist will exalt himself above the nations of the world. In fact, we see in verse 36 of Daniel 11 that he'll do as he pleases, and he curses the God of gods, the God of heaven. And we read also that he'll magnify himself above all. Now, at the time of the end, the Antichrist, we read in verses 39 through 43 of Daniel 11, will invade the glorious land, meaning Israel, and either by treaty or force conquer other nations that stand in the way of his world dominion. Now, when nations out of the east, most likely Jordan, Iran, Iraq, and to the north, especially Russia, move to defeat the Antichrist, he will mobilize his forces for the great battle of Armageddon. Now, the Lord himself, we read in the latter closing verses, will then come from heaven, and he will rush upon the Antichrist and the armies of the nations gathered for battle. That brings us to Daniel chapter 12. Now, Michael the archangel, we find him again mentioned in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1, will at that time appear that he might save Israel, even as the Antichrist will mount his final assault on God's people. Now, it is this time that is the Great Tribulation. It is the last 3.5 years of the 7-year tribulation period. We know of it from chapter 12 and verse 1 here as a time of great wickedness and trouble. In fact, it's such like the world does not see. Christ is described this time as the abomination of desolation of which Daniel had spoken. Jeremiah describes the last 3.5 years of the tribulation as a time of Jacob's troubles. Daniel chapter 2 and verse 28 and chapter 10 and verse 14 describes it as the latter days. And Daniel chapter 11 and now chapter 12 says it's the time of the end. Well, in the midst of the sorrows, Jesus Christ, we know from Isaiah chapter 2, will come to reign on the earth. And the scriptures promise true believers will be resurrected and delivered from the dead to eternal life in chapter 12 and verse 2. Now, concerning the wicked who have rejected the Lord, they are promised that they will come to shame and everlasting contempt, which will be consummated at the judgment of the great white throne. But we also read in chapter 12 and verse 3 that believers will then share in the brightness of Christ's heavenly glory. Now, Daniel 12 and verses 4 through 13, we have the details of the Great Tribulation that are sealed. Let's look at that for a moment. For instance, look at verse 5. Daniel was commanded to seal the scroll upon which he was recording the future events of the tribulation, though there would be many who would seek to understand them. And verses, as we continue, appearing before him in chapter 12 and verse 6 are two angels that appear in the vision. And one of the two questions the man clothed in linen, I've already presented. I believe it's the pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ. And one of the angels asked Christ, the man clothed in linen, how long shall it be to the end of these wonders, the end of all these things that are still before? Well, if you'll notice, as you look in this passage in 6 and verse 7, that the man in linen answered and he said, it shall be for a time, times and a half. A time being 1 year, times being 2 years, and a half being a half year. In other words, the Great Tribulation period will last for 3.5 years. And it will conclude with Israel finding no place to turn but to the Lord. For the Antichrist, we read in verse 7, will scatter crush, smash the power of the holy people, speaking of Israel. Then notice, if you would, in verses 8 through 9, what I'm describing as Daniel's confusion. Daniel desired for an explanation of what he had seen and what he had heard, but he was commanded in verse 9, "Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed to the time of the end." In other words, the prophecies are sealed, Daniel, and they will not be understood by those living until the time of the end. Now, some closing thoughts as we finish our study in the book of Daniel. In the last days, in verse 10, the true believers will be purified and made white and tried. Of course, these are trying times, and in trying times, in troubled times, the true believers will be seen for who they are. But you need to remember in verse 10 that wickedness will abound in the last years. The wicked, we read in verse 10, shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. You see, believers will understand in those last 3.5 years that which is coming to pass, but the wicked will not. And then consider then this great tribulation. It will begin with the Antichrist in Daniel 9 and verse 27, abolishing worship in the temple and setting up in the temple what is described as the abomination of desolation. The original length of the Great Tribulation would be for 1,260 days. But in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 11, you'll notice 30 days are added to that number. Now, there are various opinions as to why, but I believe it's that time in which the nations of the earth will be judged. Daniel chapter 12 and verse 12 adds another 45 days to the total of the days at the close of the tribulation. And though I cannot say with certainty, some suggest that it is during that time that Christ sets up his millennial kingdom. Again, these are inadequate explanations for what we cannot know or prove. And so I conclude the study today of Daniel, knowing that the prophet now is a very old man. Some suggest as old as 105 years old. And he is told in verse 12 and verse 13, "Blessed is he that waiteth," patiently waits, tarries. And then verse 13, "Daniel, go thy way till the end be. For thou shalt rest, stand in thy lot at the end of the days." A closing challenge in a sentence. Be patient. Live out your days and then rest. But stand fast to the end. May God find us faithful. God bless you. Tomorrow we begin a new study in the book of Ezra as Israel returns from captivity to the promised land. Bye-bye.